Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone who shared your DNA and realized they weren't seeing a brother, but a decimal point? It's a heavy realization. Most people grow up thinking family is a safety net, something that catches you when you fall. In the Callahan dynasty, family was the cliff. We weren't siblings. We were competitors in a blood sport where the prize was a global oil empire and the loser ended up as a footnote in a legal deposition. My name was Kit Callahan, the youngest of 13, the miracle baby, born to Garrison Callahan's second wife. To my father, I was the only piece of himself he still liked. To my 12 older brothers and sisters, I was a 22-year-old error in the inheritance math. Growing up in the glass house in Big Sur wasn't like a movie. It was cold. Everything was floor-to-ceiling windows and polished concrete, an architectural masterpiece that felt more like a high-security terrarium than a home. I spent my childhood trying to be invisible, hiding in the library or the servant quarters, anywhere my siblings couldn't find a reason to test me. They were all so much older, so much more hardened by our father's obsession with the survival of the fittest. Brooks, the eldest, was already running hedge funds when I was learning to ride a bike. Margot had a reputation for firing housekeepers before she turned 16, just to feel the power of the word go. They looked at me like I was a parasite, a latecomer who was going to dilute their share of the Callahan energy billions. The tension reached a breaking point last Tuesday. My father's health had been sliding for months. The man who once moved mountains and manipulated global markets was now confined to a suite on the top floor breathing through a machine. The doctor said it was a matter of days. That's when the atmosphere in the glass house changed. It became suffocating. Every time I walked into a room, the conversation stopped. I'd catch Brooks and Margot whispering in the hallway, their eyes tracking me like hawks. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that grief does weird things to people. But I knew better. In this family, grief was just a mask for greed. The family dinner was Margot's idea. She said we needed to stand united before the press descended on us. It felt wrong from the second I sat down at that massive mahogany table. 12 chairs on one side and me alone on the other. They had opened a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, the kind that costs more than a mid-sized sedan. Brooks stood up, raising his glass, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. He looked regal, composed, every bit the heir apparent. To family, he said, his voice smooth as silk. To the legacy our father built and to the strength we'll need to carry it forward together. I remember drinking. I remember the bitter metallic aftertaste that I ignored because I wanted so badly to believe he meant it. The transition from the dining room to the cliffs was a blur of nausea and terror. I realized too late that the wine wasn't just old, it was laced. My legs felt like lead, and my vision started to fragment into jagged shards of light. I tried to reach for my phone, but Jax, the most volatile of the brothers, swiped it out of my hand with a grin that haunts me even now. They didn't even argue. There was no big cinematic villain speech. It was a business transaction. They led me out toward the edge of the property where the Pacific Ocean crashes against the jagged rocks 300 feet below. The wind was howling, whipping my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. I looked back at them, my vision swimming, and saw all 12 of them standing in a semicircle. No one was crying. No one was looking away. "You were always the favorite, Kit," Margot whispered, stepping closer. She reached out and smoothed my collar. A gesture that should have been motherly, but felt like a snake coiling around my throat. "But favorites don't survive the real world. You're just a liability now. A legacy is too heavy for a boy like you." I tried to scream, to beg, to tell them I didn't want the money, that they could have it all. But my throat was paralyzed. I could only produce a wet, strangled sound. I saw Brooks check his watch, an expensive Patek Philippe, as if he had a meeting to get to. He nodded once. Just a small clinical movement of the chin. The push wasn't violent. It was a firm, collective shove. I felt multiple pairs of hands on my chest and shoulders. For a split second, I was weightless. The sound of the wind vanished, replaced by the rushing roar of the air as I tumbled backward into the dark. I saw the lights of the glass house receding, a beautiful glowing cage that I was finally escaping. I hit the water with a force that felt like slamming into a brick wall. The cold was absolute. It rushed into my lungs, extinguishing the fire of the poison, shattering my bones. As the salt water pulled me down into the black abyss, my last conscious thought wasn't about the money or the betrayal. It was the sight of those 12 silhouettes standing on the cliff watching me sink, making sure the problem was solved. Then there was nothing. No tunnel of light, no choir of angels, just a heavy crushing silence that lasted an eternity. And then a sound. A steady rhythmic beep. 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 It was annoying. It was persistent. I tried to move my hand to stop it, but my fingers felt thick, unfamiliar. I tried to open my eyes and the light was blinding, a sharp contrast to the ocean floor. I wasn't in the water. I wasn't at the base of the cliffs. I was lying in a bed that smelled of cheap detergent and old coffee. My chest didn't hurt from the impact, but my head was throbbing with a dull rhythmic ache that pulsed behind my eyelids. I struggled to sit up, my muscles protesting a weight they weren't used to carrying. My hands? I looked down at them. They weren't mine. They were larger, the skin slightly weathered with a small scar across the knuckle of the index finger that I had never seen before. I scrambled out of the bed, my balance off, tripping over a stack of legal briefs piled on the floor. I made it to the small, cracked mirror above a stained dresser in the corner of the room. The face staring back at me wasn't the 22-year-old boy who had been pushed off a cliff. It was a man in his late 40s with thinning hair at the temples and deep-set eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in a decade. I reached up, trembling, to touch the stubble on a jawline that was far too square, far too aged. I searched for the mole I used to have near my ear, but the skin there was smooth. I turned my head, gasping, as I saw a leather satchel on the chair with the initials MR embossed in gold. Beside it lay a Bar Association ID card. I picked it up, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst through this new stranger's chest. The name on the card stared back at me in bold black letters, Miller Reed, attorney at law. I slumped against the dresser, the cold glass of the mirror pressing into my forehead as the realization began to settle in like a layer of frost. I wasn't dead, but Kit Callahan was gone. I was trapped inside the skin of the man who had spent the last 15 years drafting the very documents my siblings were currently using to carve up my life. I looked at the calendar on the wall, the date circled in red, October 14th. The day of the formal will reading. I could feel the phantom sensation of the ocean water still clogging my throat, but when I inhaled, the air was dry and smelled of dust and old paper. I gripped the edge of the wooden dresser until my new knuckles turned white. My reflection blurred by the hot, stinging moisture gathering in eyes that didn't belong to me. The wood grain under my fingernails felt like jagged mountain ridges as I clawed at the edge of that dresser, desperate for the world to stop spinning. My breath came in ragged, shallow bursts, smelling of stale peppermint and the bitter dregs of a life I hadn't lived. I stared at the man in the mirror, searching for a single trace of the boy who had been swallowed by the Pacific. But there was nothing. No Julianus Kit Callahan. Just Miller Reed, a man whose face was a map of legal battles and late-night filings. The silence of the apartment was deafening, broken only by the muffled roar of Los Angeles traffic outside, a stark contrast to the rhythmic crashing of the waves that should have been my final lullaby. I reached for the ID card again, my new hands trembling so violently that the plastic clicked against the wood. Miller Reed. I knew this name. He was the shadow in the corner of my father's office, the silent architect of the Callahan Trust, the man who knew every offshore account and every dirty secret hidden in the fine print. My siblings had ignored him for years, treating him like a piece of office furniture. Now I was looking through his eyes. I felt a surge of nausea, not from the poison that had claimed my old body, but from the sheer impossible weight of this transformation. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a ghost inhabiting the enemy's lead strategist. A sharp vibration on the nightstand made me jump, nearly knocking over a lukewarm cup of black coffee. It was Miller's phone. The screen flickered with a notification that sent a cold shiver down my new spine. Incoming call. Brooks Callahan. My heart hammered against ribs that felt too wide, too heavy. I stared at the name. The memories of Brooks's clinical nod on the cliff flashing behind my eyelids like a strobe light. He thought I was at the bottom of the ocean, a problem solved by gravity and salt water. He was calling his lawyer to start the harvest. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My voice, I didn't even know what I sounded like. I cleared my throat, the sound raspy and deep, a stranger's vibration in my chest. I needed to move. I needed to see what Miller Reed knew. I grabbed the leather satchel, the weight of it anchoring me to this terrifying new reality, and began rifling through the contents. It was a gold mine of malice. Files marked confidential digital encrypted drives and a handwritten ledger that Miller had clearly been keeping for his own insurance. As I sifted through the papers, a grim realization began to take shape. Miller hadn't just been drafting the will, he had been documenting the very siblings who were now celebrating my death. He had evidence of Brooks's insider trading Margot's shell companies in the Caymans and Jax's history of paid-off assault charges. He was a man who collected leverage like other people collected stamps. But most importantly, he had the dead man's clause, a specific set of triggers my father had insisted upon, intended to protect me if the vultures ever circled too close. I stood in the center of the cramped living room, surrounded by the debris of Miller's lonely life, and felt a cold, hard resolve begin to calcify where my fear used to be. Kit Callahan was a victim. Kit Callahan was the boy who waited for a love that never came. But Miller Reed was a weapon, and I was going to wield him until there was nothing left of the Callahan name but ash. I spent the next 3 hours submerged in Miller's digital life, learning the rhythm of his correspondence and the cadence of his legal jargon. It was like learning a new language while being hunted by wolves. I dressed in one of his charcoal suits. It felt stiff and restrictive, a suit of armor for a war I hadn't asked for. The man in the mirror was gone. In his place stood the executor of the Callahan estate. I adjusted the silk tie, my fingers moving with a muscle memory that belonged to Miller, and headed for the door. The drive to the Callahan headquarters was a surreal blur. The familiar skyline of L.A. felt alien from the seat of Miller's sensible sedan. I pulled into the underground garage, my security badge chirping with a high-pitched beep that felt like a signal flare. The elevator ride to the penthouse was an exercise in pure, unadulterated terror. Every time the doors opened, I expected a hand to reach in and drag me back to the cliffs, but people just nodded. "Morning, Mr. Reed," the receptionist said without looking up from her screen. "The family's already in the boardroom. They're anxious. Anxious." I bet they were. They were waiting to sign the papers that would officially erase me from existence. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp ozone tang of high-stakes greed. The 12 of them were there, draped over the leather chairs like royalty. Brooks sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled, looking every bit the new king. Margot was checking her reflection in a compact, her face a mask of bored indifference. When I entered the room, didn't go silent. They just looked at me with the casual dismissiveness they always showed the help. "You're late, Miller," Brooks snapped, not even bothering to look my way. "Let's get this over with. The press is already asking questions about Kit's accident, and I want the probate filed before the market opens tomorrow." I felt a roar of fury in my chest, a fire that threatened to burn through Miller's calm exterior. I walked to the end of the table, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. I didn't sit down. I dropped the leather satchel onto the table with a heavy thud that made Jax flinch. I looked at them. Really looked at them, seeing the tiny cracks in their composure, the nervous sweat on Jax's brow, the way Margot's hand trembled ever so slightly as she closed her compact. "The will has been amended," I said. My voice was steady, a low baritone that sounded like grinding stones. It was a voice designed for delivering bad news. Brooks frowned, finally looking up. "Amended by whom?" "Our father is in a coma, Miller. Don't play games with me." "By the law of the state, Brooks," I replied, leaning forward until I could see my own reflection in his expensive sunglasses. I felt a twisted sense of power. They thought they were talking to a servant. They had no idea they were looking into the eyes of the boy they had murdered just 48 hours ago. There are certain contingencies that have been triggered by the recent tragedy. It seems your accident has opened a door you won't be able to close. I reached into the bag and pulled out a thick blue-bound folder. I didn't hand it to them. I held it against my chest, feeling the sharp corners dig into Miller's suit. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The boredom vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory tension. They were realizing that the man in the charcoal suit wasn't there to serve them. He was there to judge them. I began to lay the documents out on the table one by one, like a dealer in a high-stakes poker game where I already knew everyone's hand. I watched the color drain from Margot's face as she recognized the letterhead of a bank she thought was untraceable. I saw Brooks's jaw tighten until the muscles stood out like cords. The silence in the room was no longer dismissive. It was heavy with the realization that the boring lawyer had spent years building a gallows, and today was the day he intended to use it. I stood there, a ghost in a suit, watching the people who had murdered me begin to realize that the bill for my life had finally come due. I pulled a small silver pen from Miller's pocket, the same pen he had used to draft the document that had effectively signed my death warrant, and clicked it. The sound was a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the boardroom like a gunshot, and for the first time since I woke up in this stranger's body, I felt the cold, sharp edge of a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. The metallic click of that silver pen cut through the boardroom air like a guillotine blade. It was a small sound, but in the suffocating silence of the Montgomery Empire's inner sanctum, it sounded like a declaration of war. I didn't just feel like Miller Reed anymore. I felt like a conductor about to lead a symphony of destruction. Across the mahogany expanse, Brooks leaned back, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, calculated venom. He didn't know he was looking at the brother he'd drowned. He thought he was looking at a lawyer who had finally grown a spine, and he hated it. "You're overstepping, Miller." Brooks said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with the kind of threat that usually made men tremble. "We don't pay you to interpret contingencies. We pay you to file papers and stay in your lane. Now put that folder down before I decide your services are no longer required by this family." I didn't blink. Kit Callahan would have flinched. Kit would have apologized and slunk away to a corner. But Miller Reed's body was different. It felt rooted heavy with the gravity of a man who had spent decades memorizing the weaknesses of titans. I slid the first document toward him. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a forensic toxicology report, preliminary, unsigned, but devastating. "Let's talk about my lane, Brooks," I said, and the sound of my new voice, that gravelly, authoritative baritone, felt like a weapon in my hand. "My lane is ensuring the Callahan legacy survives. And right now, the legacy is being strangled by 12 people who couldn't wait 72 hours for a natural death. The wine at dinner, the vintage Bordeaux. It's amazing what a lab can find when someone pays them enough to look beneath the surface." Margot's compact slammed shut with a sharp crack, her face, usually a masterpiece of expensive Botox and practiced indifference, fractured. A flicker of genuine terror crossed her eyes before she buried it under a layer of indignant rage. "Are you accusing us of something, Miller? Because that sounds like a very expensive mistake for a man in your position." "I'm not accusing you of anything, Margot," I replied, my eyes scanning the room, landing on Jax, who was sweating so profusely his silk tie was beginning to darken. "The law is doing the accusing. You see, Garrison Callahan was a paranoid man. He didn't just build a company, he built a trap. He knew his children. He knew your debts, your vices, and your impatience. That's why he had me draft the moral turpitude codicil." I stood up, walking slowly around the table. The 12 of them watched me like I was a ticking bomb. I felt a visceral, jagged thrill. For 22 years, I had been the miracle baby they stepped on. Now, I was the giant. The codicil states that any heir involved in or even suspected of criminal activity against another family member is immediately and irrevocably disinherited. I explained, stopping behind Jax. I placed a hand on his shoulder. He jumped as if I'd touched him with a live wire. "No appeals, no arbitration. The assets don't just sit there, they revert to a blind trust for charitable distribution. You won't just lose your seats on the board. You'll lose the houses, the planes, the offshore accounts. You'll be exactly what you feared. Kit would become nothing." "You can't prove a thing," Jax hissed, though his voice cracked at the end. "The boy fell. It was an accident. Everyone saw how distraught he was lately." I leaned down, my lips inches from his ear, whispering loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I don't need to prove it in a court of law to freeze your assets, Jax. I just need to file the suspicious activity report with the SEC and the DA's office. Miller Reed has power of attorney until the probate is finalized. I can lock every single one of your accounts within the hour. I can turn off your credit cards before you even leave this building." Brooks stood up so fast his chair skidded back and hit the floor. "What do you want, Reed? Is this a shakedown? Name your price. We can double your salary, triple it. Just give us the files and walk away." I looked at him, the brother who had watched me drown with a check-watch indifference, and I felt a cold, hollow laugh vibrate in my chest. "You think this is about money? You think everyone is as small-minded as you. I walked back to the head of the table and picked up a second folder, this one thick with internal memos and printouts of encrypted chats. This isn't just about Kit. This is about the $400 million Brooks moved through shell companies last quarter. It's about Margot's consulting fees that were actually bribes for foreign oil officials. It's about the fact that all 12 of you have been cannibalizing this company for years. The room erupted. All 12 were shouting now, threats, curses, desperate denials. It was chaos, the beautiful, messy collapse of a dynasty. I stood at the center of it, as calm as the eye of a hurricane. I pulled out my phone, Miller's phone, and hit a pre-programmed command. On the massive 90-inch screen at the end of the boardroom, a series of live bank feeds appeared. "Look at the screens," I commanded, my voice cutting through the noise. One by one, the balances began to change. Account frozen, access denied, assets seized. I watched their faces as their world ended in real time. The arrogance bled out of them, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor. They weren't titans anymore. They were just people in expensive clothes with nowhere to go. "You're insane," Margot whispered, her voice trembling. "You're destroying the family." "No," I said, looking her straight in the eyes. "I'm cleaning the house. The authorities are in the lobby. They aren't here for a deposition. They're here with 12 separate warrants. Murder, conspiracy, racketeering, and tax evasion. It's a full house, Margot." The heavy oak doors swung open, but it wasn't the police yet. It was a team of stone-faced security guards I'd hired using Miller's emergency corporate fundsmen who owed no loyalty to the Callahans, only to the firm. Behind them, the first of the detectives appeared. The panic in the room turned into a frantic, pathetic scramble. Jax tried to bolt for the side exit, but he was tackled before he reached the door. Brooks sat back down, staring at the frozen numbers on the screen, his face a mask of total defeat. I didn't stay to watch the handcuffs go on. I didn't need to. I could hear the sounds of the struggle, the weeping, and the desperate pleas behind me as I walked out of the boardroom. I felt a strange, cold lightness. The revenge was surgical. I had used their own greed to trap them using the very legal webs they'd hired Miller to spin. I made my way down to the private records vault in the basement, a place where only the patriarch and his lead counsel were allowed. The air was cooler here, smelling of ozone and high-security air filtration. I needed to finish the job. I needed to ensure that no Callahan ever rose again to reclaim this poison. I walked to the master safe, my fingers moving to the keypad with a rhythmic certainty. Miller knew the code. I punched in the numbers, my father's birthday, ironically, and the heavy door hissed open. Inside were the original deeds, the physical stock certificates, and the black box, the file Garrison Callahan kept on everyone he ever met, including himself. I pulled out the drawer labeled Personal Montgomery/Callahan. I expected to find more evidence of my siblings' failures, perhaps a final letter to me, the favorite son. Instead, I found a plain manila envelope with no markings tucked behind a false back in the drawer. It felt different, thinner, older. I sat on the cold floor of the vault, the lights flickering slightly above me. I opened the envelope, my new hand steady, pulling out a single sheet of yellowing paper and a grainy black and white photograph. My breath hitched. It wasn't a legal document. It was a birth record from a clinic that hadn't existed in 20 years, and a photo of a young woman with dark, defiant eyes holding a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. As I scanned the names on the birth certificate, the world didn't just spin, it tilted on its axis. The blood in my veins, the blood I thought I was avenging, suddenly felt like a lie. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page, the name of the mother, listed not as my father's second wife, but as a woman named Agnes Miller. My eyes darted to the date, then back to the photo, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I reached out and touched the edge of the photograph, my thumb brushing against the face of the woman, who looked nothing like a Callahan, but strangely, hauntingly like the man I saw in the mirror every morning. I stood up, the paper crinkling in my grip, the silence of the vault suddenly feeling like a tomb. I turned toward the exit, my footsteps heavy as I moved toward the light, the weight of the envelope in my hand feeling heavier than the billions I had just destroyed. The silence in that vault felt different now. It wasn't the silence of a tomb, but the silence of a long-buried secret finally drawing its first breath. I stood under the flickering fluorescent light, the yellowed birth certificate trembling in my hand, and realized the vengeance I had just orchestrated was far more poetic than I could have ever imagined. My thumb traced the name, Agnes Miller. It wasn't just a coincidence. Miller Reed, the man whose body I now inhabited, wasn't just some random lawyer my father had hired. He was her son, my brother, my real brother. The grainy photo of the young woman in the hospital gown stared back at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. She didn't have the cold, chiseled features of a Callahan. She had the soft, weary eyes of someone who had been discarded after her purpose was served. I looked at the date on the certificate again. October 14th. The same date circled in red on the calendar in Miller's apartment. It wasn't the date of the will reading. It was the anniversary of the day she was kicked out of the glass house, penniless and pregnant, while Garrison Callahan brought in a socially acceptable second wife to produce a legitimate heir. I wasn't the favorite son. I was the replacement. The Kit Callahan who died in the ocean was nothing more than a high-priced decoy, a child born to satisfy a legacy that was built on a foundation of lies. Garrison hadn't loved me. He had just preferred the version of me that fit his narrative. I felt a cold, jagged laugh rise in my throat, sounding strange and hollow in Miller's chest. The 12 siblings I had just sent to prison were fighting over a throne that belonged to the woman they had spent their lives mocking. They were children of a dynasty that had effectively been stolen. My revenge hadn't just been for Kit, it was for Agnes. It was for the woman who had spent 20 years in the shadows watching her son grow up as a servant in the house that should have been his. I tucked the manila envelope into my inner suit pocket, the paper clicking against my ribs. I walked out of the vault past the empty, echoing halls of the Montgomery Callahan headquarters. Outside, the world was moving as if nothing had changed. The sun was setting over the LA skyline, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and gold. I stood on the sidewalk watching the black SUVs transport my siblings toward a life of cold cells and orange jumpsuits, and I felt nothing but a profound crystalline clarity. I didn't head back to Miller's apartment. Instead, I drove the sensible sedan toward a part of the city the Callahans never visited, a quiet, overgrown cemetery in the valley where the grass was long and the headstones were simple. I walked through the rows of graves until I found a small granite marker that looked newer than the rest. There were no flowers, no elaborate carvings, just a name and 2 dates. Agnes Miller, 1978 to 2024. I knelt in the dirt, the expensive fabric of Miller's suit staining at the knees. I reached out and touched the cold stone, the rough texture grounding me in a way the glass house never could. I wasn't Kit Callahan anymore, and I wasn't just Miller Reed the attorney. I was the bridge between 2 lives that had been torn apart by the same man's greed. "It's done," I whispered, my voice caught in the evening breeze. "They're gone, every last one of them. The empire is a ghost, and the money is going to people who actually need it." I stayed there until the stars began to poke through the smog, feeling the weight of the last 48 hours finally start to settle. I had lost my life, my name, and my family, but for the first time in 22 years, I knew exactly who I was. I was the son of a woman who refused to be forgotten, and I was the ghost who finally set the record straight. I stood up, brushing the dry earth from my knees, and looked toward the horizon. The Callahan name would be a scandal for a few weeks, a headline for a few months, and then it would vanish into the static of history. I turned my back on the grave, walking toward the car with a steady, purposeful gait. I didn't have a plan for tomorrow, and I didn't know how long this borrowed body would last. But as I pulled out into the traffic, the dashboard clock flickered over to midnight. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather familiar and firm under my hands, and took a deep, steadying breath of the cool night air. The road ahead was dark, stretching out into the unknown, but I didn't look back at the rearview mirror once. I just drove, listening to the rhythmic hum of the engine as I disappeared into the sea of lights, a stranger in my own skin, finally free from the weight of a billion-dollar lie.